pleasure to be here again, speaking at a First Friday lecture. As Michael said, my topic today is strategies for Negro advancement, BookerT Washington's Up from Slavery versus W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk. And what I'm hoping to accomplish today is a few things. One is to kind of talk about two different strategies that are revealed in these two books for talking about human progress and achieving human potential. But I also want to kind of couch that within a larger picture. One of the things that we seem to have noticed within the basic program, and I think also perhaps in the country at large, is that with the candidacy and presidency of Barack Obama, there's been a renewed interest in African American literature among non-African Americans. And one of the questions that's provoked by this, not only by this, is whether or not African American literature is really a kind of parochial or sectarian concern, specific to the concerns of African Americans, or whether there are some ways in which that literature might also have universal implications, be relevant to people who are not African American. And this same issue actually applies to any kind of group literature that you might think of. I mean, when we talk about like women's literature, for example, is that literature that really deals with concerns that are only specific to women, or are there ways in which that literature can also have universal implications, including, of course, therefore, for men? If we talk about American literature, we talk about something like Moby Dick, for example, or English literature, something like Hamlet, Roman literature, Greek literature. The issue of to what extent any of these bodies of literature are specific to the concerns of a particular historical and geographical or perhaps ethnic group is relevant, and also the extent to which these things may reveal larger or more universal issues can be considered. And my impression is that in dealing with African American literature, it's often considered to placed more within this parochial or ethnic category. And what I'd like to do today is try to see if I can expand upon that and show how in the case of Washington and Du Bois in particular, that although their primary concern was with what in that time was called something like race progress for Negroes in America, that in order to do this, both of them had thought very deeply about human nature in general, and therefore how that would apply to the particular conditions that confronted African Americans in the United States in the last half of the 19th century. So a way of approaching this, and one of the benefits I think of there's two benefits I think from taking this approach. One is I think it broadens out the concern of what would otherwise be considered African American literature, or a more narrow concern. But especially for people who are in a program like the basic program, where we spend a lot of time reading the Greeks and various others, talking about kind of ideal treatments of the human condition, there's a way in which dealing with the actual hard-nosed practicalities of the African American situation in the United States help us put some of these ideals to the test, as it were, by looking at them in concrete, tangible situations. So in the case of dealing with this literature, we're not dealing so much with theories of the ideal state, for example, as we might be dealing with in Plato's Republic, but really we're looking at issues of theory and practice of what we might think of as a better state in post-Civil War America, or as Du Bois might have put it, a state within a state, because for a very large, for most people looking at this issue, rightly or wrongly, the issue that we're looking at has traditionally been understood as the, quote, Negro problem. In other words, what is it that is to be done with Negroes, African Americans, in America? And once you frame the problem as a Negro problem, then automatically, in a certain sense, you start looking for a Negro solution. And that's a large part of what goes on in this literature. And just to point out that there are alternative ways in which this situation could have been framed, or can be framed, or is sometimes framed. For example, one alternative to looking at these set of issues as a Negro problem is to look at it as a white problem. Like, what is it about the white people in America that has created a society of a certain kind? And of course, once you frame it as a white problem, you automatically start looking for a white solution. Or if you look at it as an American problem, start looking for an American solution. Nonetheless, given America as it is and the Negroes as they were in the 19th century, a set of interrelated questions seems to have emerged. One is, what can Negroes or African Americans do to improve their lot? Secondly, what should they do to improve their lot? And kind of the whys and hows that can be done. In a sense, therefore, any strategy for Negro advancement or race advancement really consists of at least three components. One, in a sense, is that it requires a kind of state of the union, a starting point, an analysis of the actual conditions of the day. Where are we starting from, as it were? The second component that a solution seems to depend is maybe familiar to people who are in the basic program, is actually, in a certain sense, a vision of the good life. What is it, what kind of life is it that we should be striving for? What is the goal for which African Americans should be trying to reform their lives? Where should we head, as it were? And then, given a notion of where we are and where we would like to go, of course, then we need a strategy for getting from here to there, which in a very real sense requires some kind of perspective on human nature. What is it that human beings are, and what are they capable of, and what are they not capable of? And from a Negro perspective, this has to do both with the human nature of African Americans themselves, as well as the surrounding community of whites and other Americans. And so what I'd like to suggest as I start out here is that in some ways the questions that Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Dubois, and others are grappling with in this political philosophy, as it were, of African American literature, are really some of the same fundamental questions that we grapple with in any kind of work of political philosophy. For those of you who have been in the basic program and are familiar with Plato's Meno, for example, that dialogue, famous dialogue, begins, "Can you tell me, Socrates, if human excellence can be taught? Or is it practice that gives it to a man? Or natural aptitude? Or something else?" Socrates says, "It's a good question, but I can't answer it because I don't know what human excellence is. How can I know the property of something when I don't know what the thing itself is?" And that dialogue launches off on an exploration of what it means to be an excellent human being, or what virtue is, as it's sometimes translated. And really, what I'm trying to suggest, this is the same set of issues that are being addressed in these works. Or when Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics says, "The proper function of man, then, consists in an activity of the soul in conformity with a rational principle, or at least not without it." Or when he says the good of man is an activity of the soul in conformity with excellence or virtue, and if there are several virtues, in conformity with the best and most complete. This idea of looking for the good of man is the same kind of issues that W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington have to be wrestling with in a more tangible and concrete way. Or, for example, when we look at Plato's Republic, people may remember at the end of Book 9, for those who have read it, at the very end of that book, Glaucon says to Socrates, they've described the kind of the ideal city, as it were, and Glaucon says, "You mean the city whose establishment we have described, the city whose home is in the ideal, for I think it can be found nowhere on earth." To which Socrates replies, "Well, perhaps there is a pattern of it laid up in heaven for him who wishes to contemplate it, and so beholding to constitute himself its citizen. But it makes no difference whether it exists now or ever will come into being. The politics of this city only will be his, and of none other." And the point in the Republic is that after they've described the ideal city, Socrates is saying, we may not ever be able to implement this here on planet Earth, but for the person who is aware of what the ideal is, he can constitute himself to be its citizen, regardless of what the practical politics of the day may be. And I guess what I'm trying to suggest with this African American literature is that on the one hand, we're dealing with the same set of issues, and yet on the other hand, we're not dealing with some ideal city in the sky. We're dealing with some practical, concrete America on the ground. So what I'd like to do for the remainder of today's talk is to look a little bit at the situation following the Civil War and the Reconstruction, and look briefly at the Negro leadership of that period, and then to kind of look at two major figures who are commonly understood to present contrasting approaches to the problem of African Americans or to race relations in the second half of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. And then once we've done that, kind of talk about some of the generic issues that these perspectives bring to bear. So as you know, of course, the Civil War ending in 1865 was followed by a brief period of Reconstruction in the South, which was quickly abandoned, and the country moved on to other concerns. And therefore, the problems of the mass numbers of ex-slaves who had been freed in the South, as well as the problem of race relations in general, was left somewhat to fester and to the Negroes' own devices shortly after the Civil War was over. In the second half of the 19th century, African American leadership kind of sequentially fell to three individuals. During the war period itself and immediately thereafter, leadership largely fell with Frederick Douglass, whose autobiographical narrative was a major hit when it was published in 1845. He's a figure who's often studied in conjunction with Abraham Lincoln, for example, as one of the pivotal figures of the war years and therefore also of its early aftermath. Douglass died in 1895, and during the later period of the 19th century, Booker T. Washington came into the ascendancy of Negro leadership in the United States. Washington had been born in 1856, just prior to the beginning of the Civil War, and was actually born a slave, and came to freedom during the course of the Civil War and its aftermath. And therefore his autobiography is entitled Up From Slavery, as the first person account of somebody who had started as a slave, as had Frederick Douglass, for example, and then achieved freedom and gone on to a leadership position in the African American community. W.E.B. Du Bois, on the other hand, had been born in 1868 in Massachusetts, and therefore had never been a slave, and also really had a thoroughly different kind of temperament than either Frederick Douglass or Booker T. Washington. From early childhood, Du Bois had really been quite intellectually oriented, and I think his philosophical temperament comes out both in his writings and in his critique of the program of Booker T. Washington in particular. So what I'd like to do now is kind of turn sequentially to looking at Booker T. Washington and then W.E.B. Du Bois, and kind of look at what their assessment of the problem or problems were for race relations and for African Americans after the Civil War, and what their understandings of human nature, and therefore partly of what American nature was, and therefore some sense of what their solutions were. And then when we have a sense of what these two contrasting views are, we can compare them and perhaps determine the merits and demerits of either. And I'll be using some quotes from Washington's book Up From Slavery, as well as from Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk, and another essay of his called The Talented Tenth. So, if we start with Booker T. Washington and his assessment of what the problem is and what the solution is going to be for African Americans, I think I could summarize the contrast between these two positions as I start out, is that Booker T. Washington's approach to things was what we might call a bottom-up or an inside-out approach, that he wanted to deal with the problems of the largest numbers of people possible and set a foundation upon which people could build, something kind of like a Maslow's Hierarchy perspective. W.B. Du Bois's perspective is often considered to be a kind of top-down perspective, focusing on the development of an elite, which then can be used to guide the broader masses of people. And so I think we can see a bit of where these perspectives come from in the case of Booker T. Washington, for example, by having a sense of what he thought the key, or what he saw as the key problem following the Civil War. And I think the key problem that he saw following the Civil War was that what African Americans faced was that there were masses and masses and masses of ex-field hands, because the bulk of slaves obviously had been working in the fields, masses and masses of ex-field hands who were basically unable to care for themselves. And therefore the most immediately pressing concern was to develop a way for which African Americans could begin to care for themselves. He says in Up From Slavery, talking about the Emancipation Proclamation and its immediate aftermath in his own community. He says, "For some minutes there was great rejoicing and thanksgiving and wild scenes of ecstasy, but there was no feeling of bitterness. In fact, there was pity among the slaves for our former owners. The wild rejoicing on the part of the emancipated colored people lasted but for a brief period, for I noticed that by the time they returned to their cabins, there was a change in their feelings. The great responsibility of being free, of having charge of themselves, of having to think and plan for themselves and their children, seemed to take possession of them. It was very much like suddenly turning a youth of 10 or 12 years out into the world to provide for himself. In a few hours, the great questions with which the Anglo-Saxon race had been grappling for centuries had been thrown upon these people to be solved. These were the questions of a home, a living, the rearing of children, education, citizenship, and the establishment and support of churches. Was it any wonder that within a few hours the wild rejoicing ceased and a feeling of deep gloom seemed to pervade the slave quarters? To some it seemed that, now that they were in actual possession of it, freedom was a more serious thing than they had expected to find it. Some of the slaves were 70 or 80 years old. Their best days were gone. They had no strength with which to earn a living in a strange place and among strange people, even if they had been sure where to find a new place or abode. To this class, the problem seemed especially hard. Besides, deep down in their hearts, there was a strange and peculiar attachment to old master or old missus, and to their children, which they found it hard to think of breaking off. With these they had spent in some cases nearly half a century, and it was no light thing to think of parting. Gradually, one by one, stealthily at first, the older slaves began to wander from the slaves' quarters back to the big house, to have a whispered conversation with their former owners as to the future. And at another place, Washington writes, talking about the years after emancipation and the post-Reconstruction years, when he was about to found the Tuskegee Institute. He writes, "In the plantation districts, I found that as a rule, the whole family slept in one room, and that in addition to the immediate family, there sometimes were relatives, or others not related to the family, who slept in the same room. On more than one occasion, I went outside the house to get ready for bed or to wait until the family had gone to bed. They usually contrived some kind of a place for me to sleep, either on the floor or in a special part of another's bed. Rarely was there any place provided in the cabin where one could bathe even the face and hands, but usually some provision was made for this outside the house, in the yard. The common diet of the people was fat pork and corn bread. At times I have eaten in cabins where they had only corn bread and black-eyed peas cooked in plain water. The people seemed to have no other idea than to live on this fat meat and corn bread, the meat and the meal of which the bread was made having been bought at a high price at a store in town, notwithstanding the fact that the land all about the cabin homes could easily have been made to produce nearly every kind of garden vegetable that is raised anywhere in the country. Their one object seemed to be to plant nothing but cotton, and in many cases cotton was planted up to the very door of the cabin. In these cabin homes, I often found sewing machines which had been bought or were being bought on installments, frequently at a cost of as much as $60, or showy clocks for which the occupants of the cabins had paid $12 or $14. I remember that on one occasion, when I went into one of these cabins for dinner, when I sat down to a table for a meal with 4 members of the family, I noticed that while there were 5 of us at the table, there was but 1 fork for the 5 of us to use. Naturally, there was an awkward pause on my part. In the opposite corner of that same cabin was an organ for which the people told me they were paying $60 in monthly installments. 1 fork and a $60 organ. Washington goes on with lots of other anecdotes talking about the trouble, from his point of view, the problem of adjusting to free life for the newly freed slaves, and that these problems came from a number of sources, and that 2 things in particular stood out for him as the aftermath of slavery. One is that slavery itself, the institution of slavery, had devalued work, and therefore this became a cultural problem. And the second one, which this kind of thing about the organ and the sewing machines reveals, is that in many senses, from his point of view, Negroes were putting the cart before the horse. There wasn't a sense of priorities in terms of what needed to be done first, second, and so on. In the case of work itself, which for him I think was one of the major issues, Washington writes, "Ever since I have been old enough to think for myself, I entertained the idea that, notwithstanding the cruel wrongs inflicted upon us, the black man got nearly as much out of slavery as the white man did. The hurtful influences of the institution were not by any means confined to the Negro. This was fully illustrated by the life upon our own plantation. The whole machinery of slavery was so constructed as to cause labor, as a rule, to be looked upon as a badge of degradation, of inferiority. Hence, labor was something that both races on the slave plantation sought to escape. The slave system on our place, in a large measure, took the spirit of self-reliance and self-help out of the white people. My old master had many boys and girls, but not one, so far as I know, ever mastered a single trade or special line of productive industry. The girls were not taught to cook, sew, or to take care of the house. All this was left to the slaves. The slaves, of course, had little personal interest in the life of the plantation, and their ignorance prevented them from learning how to do things in the most improved and thorough manner. As a result of the system, fences were out of repair, gates were hanging half off the hinges, doors creaked, window panes were out, plastering had fallen but was not replaced, weeds grew in the yard. As a rule, there was food for whites and blacks, but inside the house and on the dining room table there was wanting that delicacy and refinement of touch and finish which can make a home the most convenient, comfortable, and attractive place in the world. Withal, there was a waste of food and other materials which was sad. When freedom came, the slaves were almost as well fitted to begin life anew as the master, except in the matter of book learning and ownership of property. The slave owner and his sons had mastered no special industry. They unconsciously had imbibed the feeling that manual labor was not the proper thing for them. On the other hand, the slaves in many cases had mastered some handicraft, and none were ashamed, and few unwilling to labor. So part of the point here, I think, from Washington's perspective, is that the slave system as a whole made both whites and blacks look upon work as something degrading. It was something befitting of slaves and not befitting of free people. And therefore, when the slave system came to an end, both whites and blacks in a certain way were somewhat loath to work. And in the case of the freed slaves, this led to a number of attempts in the post-war years to kind of evade work. And in addition to the question of evading work, there was also this kind of fascination on the part of the newly freed slaves with this thing called book learning, which they imagined had some kind of quasi-magical properties. In later years, when Washington was at the Hampton Institute, a school that he attended and then worked at before he founded Tuskegee, he writes, at Hampton, the student was constantly making the effort through the industries to help himself, and that very effort was of immense value in character building. The students at the other schools seemed to be less self-dependent. They seemed to give more attention to mere outward appearances. In a word, they did not appear to me to be beginning at the bottom on a real solid foundation to the extent that they were at Hampton. They knew more about Latin and Greek when they left school, but they seemed to know less about life and its conditions as they would meet it in their homes. Having lived for a number of years in the midst of comfortable surroundings, they were not as much inclined as the Hampton students to go into the country districts of the South, where there was little of comfort, to take up work for our people, and they were more inclined to yield to the temptation to become hotel waiters and Pullman car porters as their life work. During the time I was a student in Washington, the city was crowded with colored people, many of whom had recently come from the South. A large proportion of these people had been drawn to Washington because they felt that they could lead a life of ease there. Others had secured minor government positions, and still another large class was there in the hope of securing federal positions. A number of colored men, some of them very strong and brilliant, were in the House of Representatives, and one was in the Senate. All this tended to make Washington an attractive place for members of the colored race. Then, too, they knew that at all times they could have the protection of the law in the District of Columbia. The public schools in Washington were better than they were elsewhere. I took great interest in studying the life of our people there closely at that time. I found that while among them there was a large element of substantial worthy citizens, there was also a superficiality about the life of a large class that alarmed me. I saw young colored men who were not earning more than $4 a week spend $2 or more on a buggy on Sunday to ride up and down Pennsylvania Avenue in order that they might try to convince the world that they were worth thousands. I saw other young men who received $75 or $100 per month from the government who were in debt at the end of every month. I saw men who but a few months previous were members of Congress, then without employment and in poverty. Among a large class, there seemed to be a dependence upon the government for every considerable thing. And finally, he says, in a word, while their wants had been increased, their ability to supply their wants had not been increased in the same degree. So these two factors, Washington sensed that there was a broad mass of people who were facing the problems of freedom for the first time, and that also there was a difficulty in assessing priorities and figuring out the fundamentals of life rather than what he called the superficialities of life, became the foundation for his establishment of the Tuskegee Institute, which was to be a school, but a school that was not focused on what he called mere book learning, but a school that was intended to teach the fundamentals of what he called civilization or of life. And that this was really to inculcate a kind of work ethic and the development of a kind of self-respect that would come from this. And I think this is the beginning of one of the places where the contrast between Washington and Du Bois begins to come together. Because Washington was content to take a sequential approach to race progress. That in the beginning, the blacks would have to look to themselves to develop their own character, to develop their own work ethic, to develop their own sense of values and priorities, and that over time this would contribute in part to race progress. And this is part of Washington's vision of human nature. He had a sense that human beings can't but help respect one another when they see something well done. He says in part, mere connection with what is known as a superior race will not permanently carry an individual forward unless he has individual worth, and mere connection with what is regarded as an inferior race will not finally hold an individual back if he possesses intrinsic individual merit. Every persecuted individual and race should get much consolation out of the great human law, which is universal and eternal, that merit, no matter under what skin found, is in the long run recognized and rewarded. And this is really one of the key things from the work ethic that Washington tried to instill at the Tuskegee Institute. For example, this idea that doing a job well would eventually command the respect of the people around them. He says, "My experience is that there is something in human nature which always makes an individual recognize and reward merit, no matter under what color of skin merit is found. I have found, too, that it is the visible, the tangible, that goes a long ways in softening prejudices. The actual sight of a first-class house that a Negro has built is 10 times more potent than pages of discussion about a house that he ought to build or perhaps could build." He continues, "The individual who can do something that the world wants done will in the end make his way regardless of race. One man may go into a community prepared to supply the people there with an analysis of Greek sentences. The community may not at that time be prepared for or feel the need of Greek analysis, but it may feel its need of bricks and houses and wagons. If the man can supply the need for those, then it will lead eventually to a demand for the first product, and with the demand will come the ability to appreciate it and to profit by it." So all in all, if I can try to summarize, Washington's attempt at this solution is what we might call a kind of social or cultural triage, that he was looking at a mass problem with a huge numbers of people who were living marginal lives, and he wanted, in a sense, a way to get the most bang for the buck, you might say, in improving the largest number of lives most quickly. And that there were kind of 5 components that went into this. One was this idea of education, but his sense of education was educating people to what he called civilization or work, not mere book learning. And this issue of the status of book learning is something we're going to come back to with Dubois, because it's one of the areas that they differed quite a bit on. But so one is education. The second was a kind of work ethic that really, despite the purported lesson of the slave experience, that work was not only not ignoble, but was actually noble. And therefore it was okay to work, it was good to work, it was necessary to work. It's one of the reasons why at Tuskegee students it was demanded of students that they work on the construction of the buildings and the operation of the school. A third element of Washington's program was the mass production of teachers to teach the large numbers of newly freed slaves. And so what we're talking about here is really kind of elementary school style teachers, and therefore there was a large focus on what in those days was called normal schools, which were for the production of teachers to work with these mass numbers of students. The fourth element was that intellectuals, in a sense, people whose self-fulfillment or self-actualization came from something beyond kind of like elementary levels of education or industrial work, really were called upon to subordinate themselves to the larger needs of their community, that they should work at helping the larger numbers of people progress rather than their own self-fulfillment. And that really Washington took what was a kind of long, might be called a long time frame, that he knew that this problem wasn't going to be solved in a week or a year or even a decade, and therefore he was content to take this various elements of the problem in order. One of his most famous speeches, which I won't read here because we don't have enough time, but he is kind of the culmination of the Up From Slavery book, is his speech to the Atlanta Exposition in 1895, which kind of catapulted Booker T. Washington into national prominence. But when it comes to this question of sequential progress, Washington said in that speech, "The wisest among my race understand that the agitation of questions of social equality is the extremist folly, and that progress in the enjoyment of all the privileges that will come to us must be the result of severe and constant struggle rather than of artificial forcing. No race that has anything to contribute to the markets of the world is long in any degree ostracized. It is important and right that all the privileges of the law be ours, but it is vastly more important that we be prepared for the exercises of these privileges. The opportunity to earn $1 in a factory just now is worth infinitely more than the opportunity to spend $1 in an opera house." Right? And I think this is one of these passages that is often misconstrued or misunderstood from Washington. I don't think he is in any sense arguing in favor of perpetual inequality between the races, but I think he's also recognizing or claiming that immediate equality, A, is not possible, and that B, if it's not possible, focusing on the elements of equality that are critical immediately are more important than focusing on the ones that have more glamour to them, let's say. And therefore, industrial equality, economic equality, the equality to earn $1 today, according to Washington, is actually more important than whether or not blacks are enabled or allowed to spend that $1 in an opera house, which today, according to Washington, is not a key need of the newly freed slave population. So with that in hand, let me see if I can turn a little bit to the W.E.B. Du Bois. And Du Bois comes a little bit after Washington and grew up kind of in the shadow of Washington's leadership. So both is reacting against Washington's leadership in some particular ways. And as I also mentioned, because he himself had never been a slave on the one hand, and also came from a northern and a more intellectual background, really had a different kind of sensibility, than Washington did, and perhaps many other people of his era. And Du Bois writes in The Souls of Black Folk about Booker T. Washington's leadership. He says, "On the whole, the distinct impression left by Mr. Washington's propaganda is, first, that the South is justified in its present attitude towards the Negro because of the Negro's degradation. Secondly, that the prime cause of the Negro's failure to rise more quickly is his wrong education in the past. And thirdly, that his future rise depends primarily on his own efforts. Each of these propositions is a dangerous half-truth. The supplementary truths must never be lost sight of. First, slavery and race prejudice are potent, if not sufficient, causes of the Negro's position. Second, industrial and common school training were necessarily slow in planting because they had to await the black teachers trained by higher institutions. And third, while it is a great truth to say that the Negro must strive, and strive mightily, to help himself, it is equally true that unless his striving be not simply seconded, but rather aroused and encouraged by the initiative of the richer and wiser environing group, he cannot hope for great success. In his failure to realize and impress this last point, Mr. Washington is especially to be criticized. So I think Du Bois is saying here that really I think this is the key thing that a lot of people often miss with Du Bois's critique of Washington, is not that Washington is wrong in the elements that he's identified, but according to Du Bois, these are half-truths, not complete truths, and that in order to understand the complete situation, you have to understand the supplementary components. And one of the key components that Du Bois was critical of was this focus on normal schools for training of elementary teachers. This idea that since we had masses of uneducated ex-slaves, we needed masses of kind of elementary school teachers. But Du Bois raises the question of who will teach the teachers? And therefore, this question of social advancement, as it were, is really kind of finally focused on this question of higher education. And Du Bois eventually came up with a concept for which he became famous, known as the talented tenth, which was this idea that there would be an elite, or there was an elite, not just within the African American community, but within every community, that there's a kind of trickle-down theory here of social and cultural progress. In an essay called The Talented Tenth, Du Bois wrote, "The Negro race, like all races, is going to be saved by its exceptional men. The problem of education, then, among Negroes must first of all deal with the talented tenth. It is the problem of developing the best of this race, that they may guide the mass away from contamination and death of the worst in their own and other races. Now, the training of men is a difficult and intricate task. Its technique is a matter for educational experts, but its object is for the vision of seers. If we make money the object of man training, we shall develop money makers, but not necessarily men. If we make technical skill the object of education, we may possess artisans, but not in nature men. Men we shall have only as we make manhood the object of the work of the schools. Intelligence, broad sympathy, knowledge of the world that was and is, and of the relation of men to it. This is the curriculum that higher education which must underlie true life. On this foundation, we may build breadwinning, skill of hand, quickness of mind, with never a fear lest the child and man mistake the means of living for the object of life." And this really, in some ways, leads to Du Bois's concern with the Negro University or the Negro College. That from his point of view, it's at the university level that the elite of African Americans, or indeed of any social group or of mankind as a whole, is going to be trained. And for those of us who are in the basic program at the University of Chicago in general, obviously we spend our lives to some degree in a university setting, and either implicitly or perhaps explicitly must think there's some value to this, otherwise we wouldn't do it. But I find it striking and kind of telling, and goes back to my larger point here, that in all my years of being involved in academics and education, I have found what I think is the most eloquent statement of defense and the value of a university education to be in W.E.B. Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk. He writes, "The function of the university is not simply to teach breadwinning, or to furnish teachers for the public schools, or to be a center of polite society. It is, above all, to be the organ of that fine adjustment between real life and the growing knowledge of life, an adjustment which forms the secret of civilization. Such an institution the South of today sorely needs. She has religion, earnest, bigoted, religion that on both sides of the veil often omits the 6th, 7th, and 8th commandments, but substitutes a dozen supplementary ones. She has, as Atlanta shows, growing thrift and love of toil, but she lacks that broad knowledge of what the world knows and knew of human living and doing, which she may apply to the 1,000 problems of real life today confronting her. The need of the South is knowledge and culture, not in dainty limited quantity as before the war, but in broad busy abundance in the world of work. And until she has this, not all the apples of the Hesperides, be they golden and bejeweled, can save her from the curse of Boeotian lovers. The wings of Atalanta are the coming universities of the South. They alone can bear the maiden past the temptation of golden fruit. They will not guide her flying feet away from the cotton and gold. For, thoughtful Hippomenes, do not the apples lie in the very way of life? But they will guide her over and beyond them, and leave her kneeling in the sanctuary of truth and freedom and broad humanity, virgin and undefiled. Sadly did the Old South err in human education, despising the education of the masses and niggardly in the support of colleges. Her ancient university foundations dwindled and withered under the foul breath of slavery, and even since the war they have fought a failing fight for life in the tainted air of social unrest and commercial selfishness, stunted by the death of criticism and starving for lack of broadly cultured men. If this is the white South's need and danger, how much heavier the danger and need of the freedmen's sons, how pressing here the need of broad ideals and true culture, the conservation of soul from sordid aims and petty passions. Let us build the Southern University, William and Mary, Trinity, Georgia, Texas, Tulane, Vanderbilt, and the others, fit to live. Let us build, too, the Negro universities, Fisk, whose foundation was ever broad, Howard at the heart of the nation, Atlanta at Atlanta, whose ideal of scholarship has been held above the temptation of numbers. Why not here, and perhaps elsewhere, plant deeply and for all time centers of learning and living, colleges that would yearly send into the life of the South a few white men and a few black men of broad culture, Catholic tolerance, and trained ability, joining their hands to other hands and giving to this squabble of the races a decent and dignified peace. Patience, humility, manners, and taste, common schools and kindergartens, industrial and technical schools, literature and tolerance, all these spring from knowledge and culture, the children of the university. So must men and nations build, not otherwise, not upside down. Teach workers to work, a wise saying when applied to German boys and American girls, wiser when said of Negro boys, for they have less knowledge of working and none to teach them. Teach thinkers to think, a needed knowledge in a day of loose and careless logic, and they whose lot is gravest must have the carefulest training to think aright. If these things are so, how foolish to ask, what is the best education for 1 or 7 or 60 million souls? Shall we teach them trades or train them in liberal arts? Neither and both. Teach the workers to work and the thinkers to think. Make carpenters of carpenters and philosophers of philosophers and fops of fools. Nor can we pause here. We are training not isolated men, but a living group of men, nay, a group within a group. And the final product of our training must be neither a psychologist nor a brick mason, but a man. And to make men, we must have ideals, broad, pure, and inspiring ends of living, not sordid money-getting, not apples of gold. The worker must work for the glory of his handiwork, not simply for pay. The thinker must think for truth, not for fame. And all this is gained only by human strife and longing, by ceaseless training and education, by founding right on righteousness and truth on the unhampered search for truth, by founding the common school on the university and the industrial school on the common school, and weaving thus a system, not a distortion, and bringing a birth, not an abortion. Now, as I say, I think this is one of the most eloquent statements I've ever seen of the function of the university and of higher education. And whether one agrees with it or not, I think you can see that there are a number of components of it that are really quite oppositional to the program that Booker T. Washington had in mind. That really, Washington's goal was really, if you think of Maslow's hierarchy, that the race progress, in a sense, for Negroes in America was going to be from the bottom up. First, we take care of the fundamental details of living, making a living, learning how to have self-respect, how to win the respect of others, how to earn $1 in a factory today, and that once these stages have been completed, the subsequent stages would come along until ultimately, over time, Negro society, African American society, would have be fully faceted, just like a white American society would be. Whereas Du Bois is really saying is, we need leaders at the top who have some vision of where we're trying to go, and that we need them from the very beginning. It's not something that we can defer until a later day. And this this difference in the two perspectives is kind of is revealed in an anecdote that both men refer to in their books, and it becomes kind of like a Rorschach test. Booker T. Washington, in talking about his travels in the South, describes what he says one of the most disheartening scenes that he had ever seen was that he had come upon a young black man who was ill-clothed, ill-fed, really didn't have any employment, kind of out in the woods, as it were. And from Washington, and what the young man was doing was studying a book of French grammar. And from Washington's point of view, the idea that this unfed, unclothed, unemployed, unhoused young black fellow was studying a French grammar was the height of absurdity. Why are you fooling around with this foreign language when you can't even, take care of your basic bodily needs? And this was for Washington a sense of an example of this kind of misplaced priorities that the newly freed slaves often had. Du Bois, on the other hand, looked at the situation completely opposite, and he wrote of Booker T. Washington. He says, "And so thoroughly did Washington learn the speech and thought of triumphant commercialism and the ideals of material prosperity, that the picture of a lone black boy poring over a French grammar amid the weeds and dirt of a neglected home soon seemed to him the acme of absurdities. One wonders what Socrates and St. Francis of Assisi would say to this. And yet, this very singleness, this vision and thorough oneness with his age, is a mark of the successful man. It is as though nature must needs make men narrow in order to give them force. And I think this image of what it means to be poor but studying some French grammar for these two thinkers really reflects two different visions of life. For Dubois, it's actually a glorious thing that somebody could be without all of his material needs and still be so enthralled by this intellectual endeavor. And that after all, what is the ultimate value of all this material prosperity anyway? And I think that this maybe is one way of kind of bringing this to a close and talking, just summarizing in some ways one of the differences between Washington and Du Bois. And this kind of takes me back to my initial theme that I think the issues here are actually bigger than just of relevance to African Americans. That in a sense, and I'm not, without taking a stand on either side, that both based on their backgrounds and their personal temperaments and their assessment of human life and what the United States was about, that in some sense, Booker T. Washington developed a goal of making Negroes fully American. And to the extent that the business of America is business, that really meant helping Negroes to develop a kind of commercial attitude and orientation that fit in with the national ethic. But W.E.B. Du Bois, on the other hand, I think was more concerned with making Negroes fully human beings, as he would understand it. And that for Du Bois, while it may be true that the business of America is business, for Du Bois, that's not an adequate understanding of the business of man. And that therefore Du Bois's critique of Washington would actually turn out to be pretty much the same in some respects as his critique of the United States as a whole. And where one falls in this spectrum or takes sides, I think depends partly on one's own temperament and background as well. Anyway, I hope I've been able to provide a little bit of an overview of some of these issues. I'll pause now, and if some people need to leave, we'll let you go. And if there are people who want to ask some questions after this, we'll take some questions. Thank you very much.